Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I understand that tonight we're going to talk about psychotherapy.
Mr. Branden, do you believe that there is in principle one ideal system or type of psychotherapy?
My answer to that question would depend upon what precisely is meant. To begin with, since the psychotherapist has to deal with a great many different kinds of problems, there is not one system or approach which is going to be right for every possible patient. So from that point of view, you have to adapt the system or the approach to the needs of the particular kind of problem that has to be solved. I don't know of any type of therapy that has ever been propounded where the originator would claim that it was the preferred method for every conceivable type of psychological problem. But even within the standard so-called neurosis, I hesitate to speak of one ideal system of psychotherapy for this reason. It's a demonstrable fact that people have been helped by a wide assortment of therapeutic techniques. There is ample empirical evidence that people have been helped or improved by therapists whose approaches were different in a great many respects. Now, I think if you studied these differences, you would certainly find some basic underlying principles. And yet, let's not minimize the differences. For example, one of the things which we do in therapy is we want to help a patient to de-repress and to get in better touch with his own emotions. Now, there can be 10, 20, 30, 40 different methods or techniques that might be effective to achieve this end. The same therapist might use different techniques with different patients or clients. And different therapists will use different techniques because one will feel more comfortable for him given his personality, and therefore he will be able to use it more naturally and more effectively than another. This is just an example sufficient to make clear why I would be very slow to say there is one ideal system, unless one were to propound the following. I can see in the future the development of a very comprehensive, unified system of therapy that would contain within it a very wide assortment of techniques. And individual therapists would tend to use those that they felt most comfortable working with, and also would use those that they felt were especially appropriate for individual differences. But there is at the present no such unified overall system of therapy in existence. I think it would be a very challenging effort, challenging problem to try to develop such a system, but it doesn't exist now. And if there were to be an ideal system of psychotherapy, it would have to be much more comprehensive than any known system of therapy at present, and we would have to know much more about psychology and psychological problems and techniques for their correction than any of us know at present. I might mention that I am working toward the formulation of a more general theory of psychotherapy than I have presented in the past. Now, I don't want the foregoing to leave the implication that right now it's deuces wild and that all systems of psychotherapy are equally valid, because they are not. In the last chapter of The Psychology of Self-Esteem, I outlined certain very broad general principles about my own approach to psychotherapy. And while I am in full agreement with everything I said in that chapter, I have learned a great deal in the slightly more than 2 years since I wrote it. And if I were writing a new essay on psychotherapy today, there's a great deal of vital information I'd want to include, and so I will certainly have to take up that subject again. To repeat, not contradicting anything I said, but that essay is very, very general. It's very much concerned with broad outlines rather than with specific technique. And I'd like to write much more about specific technique. But what can we say within the context of our present knowledge as a basic minimum would an ideal system of psychotherapy have to have? Well, first of all, let's make a distinction between the theory by which we understand the nature and causes of psychological problems and the techniques by which we seek to correct those problems. You see, there certainly can be only one true theory which would account for the psychological problems, but there could be a variety of techniques that might help a person to resolve certain conflicts. Now, suppose a person comes in, for example, with migraine headaches, which are psychologically caused, let's assume. These headaches might proceed from some highly specific conflicts which the person has repressed, and a very limited type of therapy might be quite adequate to resolve the headaches. It might be an issue of unearthing these conflicts, of having the client or patient perhaps relive and re-experience and subsequently reappraise some traumatic experiences and thereby liberate himself from these headaches. And you might do this without necessarily getting into wider questions of the patient's values or his beliefs in other subjects, where you could deal with specific techniques aimed at specific symptom removal on a relatively delimited plane. However, for the kind of problems that I deal with in my own practice, and that more and more people are seeking help with today, you need a much wider repertoire of techniques than the kind that might be called upon for this kind of problem. You need, this problem of course would require it too, techniques aimed at de-repressing emotions and subterranean conflicts. You need techniques that would help the patient to achieve a better integrated value system, one that will permit him to function as a better integrated human being and to serve his own interests more effectively when he acts. You would need a system which would have methods and techniques for helping the patient to think more clearly. You would have to make the patient aware of the particular types of defenses that he utilizes, by means of which he tries to avoid painful features of reality, to preserve perhaps a precarious pseudo-self-esteem, and to avoid confronting painful thoughts, memories, or feelings. You would need techniques or methods by which you could help the client or patient to behave differently in the conduct of his life, and thus generate a more positive feedback that would enhance his own self-esteem. So that if you were to ask me in a very general way, what are the goals of psychotherapy, I would name the kind of features I've just talked about. To raise the level of the patient's self-esteem, to help him to deal with the facts of life without resorting to reality avoidance defense mechanisms, helping him to think more effectively, helping him to be in better contact with his inner emotional life, helping himself to know himself better, You see, in conclusion, here is just one feature that although I do discuss it in the psychology of self-esteem, I didn't stress it as much as I would stress it if I were writing on that subject today.